The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of the house I'd called home for 32 years, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum floor. I stood at the counter, methodically folding my son Lester's laundry, crisp dress shirts for his accounting firm, tiny superhero t-shirts for my grandsons, delicate blouses that belonged to his wife, Elsie. My hands moved automatically through the ritual I'd performed countless times, but today something felt different. The silence pressed against my ears like cotton, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're listening from. At 63, I'd grown accustomed to quiet mornings. The house that once burst with Lester's laughter and teenage chaos now echoed with emptiness most days. But it was my emptiness, earned through decades of mortgage payments, careful budgeting, and the kind of stubborn determination that had carried me through my husband's death 8 years ago. Gregory had left me this house free and clear, along with a small piece of rural property outside town that we'd bought as a retirement dream. "Someday we'll build a little cabin there," he used to say, pointing to the old survey map spread across our dining room table. "Just you and me and the trees." That someday never came for Gregory, but the land remained mine. 23 acres of what everyone assumed was worthless scrub on the outskirts of Millfield Creek. Even Lester rolled his eyes whenever I mentioned it. "Mom, that old plot? It's in the middle of nowhere. You can't even get decent cell service out there." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been quietly watching the county development plans. I'd noticed the subtle changes in zoning maps, the whispered conversations at town council meetings about the new tech corridor. Sometimes being invisible had its advantages. The front door slammed with the particular force that announced Elsie's arrival. My daughter-in-law had never learned to close a door gently. Everything in her world demanded attention, demanded drama. I heard her heels clicking across the hardwood in the entryway, each step a staccato announcement of her presence. "Janet? Are you here?" Her voice carried that tone I'd learned to recognize over the past 5 years. The one that suggested my existence in my own home was somehow conditional on her approval. "In the kitchen, dear." I kept my voice level, pleasant. I'd perfected this tone too, the one that gave nothing away. Elsie appeared in the doorway, her perfectly straightened blonde hair catching the morning light. She wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. At 34, she radiated the kind of polished confidence that came from never having truly struggled for anything. "Oh, good. You're doing the laundry." She swept past me to the coffee maker, helping herself to the pot I'd brewed an hour earlier. "I was hoping we could talk." I continued folding, watching her from my peripheral vision. Elsie had a way of making conversations sound casual when they were anything but. "Of course. How are the boys?" "They're fine. Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss." She leaned against the counter, cradling her mug like a prop. "Lester and I have been talking about their future. College costs. You know how it is these days. And with the economy being so uncertain," the stack of tiny t-shirts grew under my hands. 8-year-old Daniel's favorite Batman shirt, 6-year-old Timothy's soccer jersey with the grass stains I'd spent 20 minutes working out the night before. I'd been the one to buy these clothes, to wash them, to fold them. I'd been the one picking the boys up from school when Elsie's yoga classes ran late, the one making them dinner when Lester worked overtime. "College is expensive," I agreed, setting down Timothy's jersey and reaching for another shirt. "But they're still young. Plenty of time to save." Elsie's laugh had a brittle quality to it. "Save? Janet, we're barely keeping up with the mortgage as it is. Lester's salary is good, but with 2 kids, and the cost of everything going up," she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. I knew their financial situation better than she realized. I'd seen the credit card statements left carelessly on my kitchen counter, noticed the expensive takeout containers in my garbage can, observed the steady stream of Amazon packages arriving at my door addressed to them. Their idea of financial hardship differed significantly from mine. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said carefully. "You always do." Elsie set down her mug with more force than necessary. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. We have an idea, a way to secure the boys' future and take some pressure off all of us." The word "all" struck me as interesting. I hadn't realized I was under any pressure that needed relieving. This house, Elsie continued, gesturing around the kitchen that I'd painted and repainted, where I'd hosted countless birthday parties and holiday dinners, where I'd comforted Lester through teenage heartbreaks and celebrated his graduation. It's just so big for one person. And with property values in this neighborhood going up, it could be a real asset for the family. I stopped folding. The morning light seemed harsher suddenly, casting sharper shadows across Elsie's face. What exactly are you suggesting? She smiled then, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Well, if you were to sign the house over to Lester, put it in his name for estate planning purposes, it would protect it from any potential issues down the line. Taxes, you know. And then we could all live here together, really make it a family home again. The boys would have more space, you'd have help with maintenance, and everyone wins. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the clock. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and strong. 63 years of life had taught me to recognize manipulation, even when it wore designer clothes and spoke in reasonable tones. I see. I picked up another shirt, smoothing the fabric between my fingers. And where exactly would I fit in this family arrangement? Oh, Janet. You'd have your own space, of course. Maybe we could convert the basement into a nice little apartment for you. Put in a kitchenette. Make it really cozy. Elsie's voice took on an almost patronizing sweetness. And think about it. You wouldn't have to worry about property taxes anymore, or maintenance costs. Lester would handle all of that. The basement. My basement. Where I'd done laundry for 3 decades. Where Gregory's workbench still held his tools. Where Lester had played as a child on rainy days. They wanted to stick me in the basement of my own house and call it kindness. I set down the laundry and turned to face Elsie directly. That's quite a generous offer. Something in my tone must have alerted her because her smile faltered slightly. It really would be the smart thing to do, Janet. For everyone involved. Of course it would. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden where I'd planted roses the year after Gregory died, where I'd taught my grandsons to recognize different types of birds. Can I think about it? Elsie's smile returned, brighter now. Absolutely. But don't think too long. Lester's really excited about the idea, and you know how he gets when he has his mind set on something. Yes, I knew exactly how Lester got. He'd inherited his father's persistence, but none of his patience. When Lester wanted something, he pursued it with the single-minded determination of a child who'd never truly been told no. After Elsie left, I remained at the kitchen window, watching a cardinal peck at the bird feeder I'd filled that morning. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the glass beneath my palm. In a few hours, I'd pick up Daniel and Timothy from school, help them with homework, listen to their chatter about friends and teachers and playground politics. I'd make them snacks and remind them to wash their hands and feel for a few hours, like I mattered in their world. But first, I had some thinking to do. I walked through the house slowly, taking inventory. The living room where Gregory and I had slow danced to old records, where Lester had taken his first steps, where I'd held vigil during my husband's final illness. The dining room with its mahogany table that had hosted every major family celebration, its surface scarred with decades of use but still solid, still beautiful. The master bedroom where I'd raised a child, mourned a husband, and learned to sleep alone. This house wasn't just property to be transferred and managed. It was my life, measured in mortgage payments and maintenance calls, in painted walls and planted gardens. It was the foundation I'd built for my family, brick by brick, year by year, with my own hands and Gregory's steady presence beside me. Elsie's words echoed in my mind. Everyone wins. But as I stood in my front hallway, looking up at family photos that chronicled 30 years of birthdays and holidays, I wondered exactly who she meant by everyone. The grandfather clock chimed 11 times, and I made my decision. Not the one Elsie expected, but the one that had been forming in my mind since her perfectly manicured fingers had gestured dismissively around my kitchen. I had some phone calls to make, some appointments to schedule. If Lester wanted to play games with his mother's future, he was about to learn that I'd been playing this game much longer than he had. After all, I'd raised him. I knew exactly how his mind worked. And unlike Elsie, I'd learned long ago that sometimes the smartest move is the one no one sees coming. 3 days later, Lester arrived for what Elsie had undoubtedly coached him to call a family discussion. I watched from my kitchen window as he sat in his car for several minutes, engine running, probably rehearsing the speech his wife had prepared for him. At 35, my son still had the habit of running his hands through his dark hair when he was nervous, a tell I'd recognized since his elementary school presentations. I'd spent those 3 days in careful preparation, phone calls to my attorney, Denzel Powell, who'd handled Gregory's estate and had known our family for 15 years, a visit to the county assessor's office, where I'd quietly requested updated valuations on both properties, a long conversation with my accountant about tax implications and asset protection. I'd even driven out to Millfield Creek, walking the perimeter of that worthless land while taking photographs with my phone. 23 acres that had once seemed like an impossible dream now looked like salvation. But most importantly, I'd practiced. I'd stood in front of my bedroom mirror and rehearsed the performance of a lifetime, the role of a confused, grateful mother who was touched by her family's concern for her future. Lester finally emerged from his car, straightening his tie as he walked up the front steps. He used his key without knocking, another small liberty that hadn't gone unnoticed. I heard him pause in the entryway, probably steeling himself for the conversation ahead. "Mom, you home?" "In the kitchen, sweetheart." I kept my voice warm, welcoming. I'd set the stage carefully, fresh coffee brewing, a plate of his favorite oatmeal cookies cooling on the counter, the morning light streaming through windows I'd cleaned until they sparkled. If Elsie had taught me anything, it was the importance of presentation. Lester appeared in the doorway, and my heart clenched despite everything. He was still my baby boy, even in his expensive suit with his carefully styled hair. I could see Gregory in the line of his jaw, in the way he held his shoulders. But when he smiled, I saw Elsie's calculation behind it. "Smells great in here." He leaned down to kiss my cheek, a gesture that once would have warmed me completely. Now I noticed how perfunctory it felt, how quickly he pulled away. "Elsie said she talked to you about our idea." "She did." I poured him coffee in the mug I'd bought him for Father's Day 2 years ago. "World's best dad," in fading blue letters. "Sit down, honey. We should talk." He settled into his usual chair at the kitchen table, the one where he'd done homework for 12 years, where he'd told me about his first job, his engagement, his dreams of starting his own firm someday. I wondered if he remembered any of those conversations, or if this kitchen had become just another stage for him to perform on. "I've been thinking about what Elsie suggested," I began, sitting across from him with my own mug. "About the house." Lester leaned forward slightly, and I caught the flash of excitement he tried to hide. "And? Well, I have to admit I'm not getting any younger." I let a slight tremor enter my voice, watched him relax as he heard what he expected to hear. "The maintenance, the property taxes, it's a lot for one person." "Exactly." The words burst out of him with relief. "Mom, Elsie and I have been so worried about you managing all this on your own. The house is beautiful, but it's just too much." I nodded slowly, as if considering this profound wisdom for the first time. The boys are growing so fast, too. They need more space, more stability. They do. And think about it. We'd all be together, a real family unit again. Lester reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "I know it's a big decision, but it really would be the best thing for everyone." Everyone. That word again. "The basement apartment idea is interesting," I said carefully. "Elsie mentioned converting it, making it comfortable." "Absolutely. We'd make it perfect for you. Your own entrance, privacy when you want it, but close enough that we could help with anything you need." His enthusiasm was growing, probably picturing the equity he'd gain, the financial freedom my house would provide. "And Mom, legally speaking, it just makes sense. Estate planning, tax advantages?" "Tax advantages? Well, yeah. If something happened to you, God forbid, the house would pass smoothly to family without all those probate complications." He squeezed my hand. "It's really about protecting what you and Dad built together." The mention of Gregory made my chest tighten. My husband would have seen through this manipulation in seconds. Gregory had possessed an innate ability to spot people who wanted something from him, a skill I'd clearly failed to pass on to our son. "I appreciate that you're thinking of my future," I said softly, "but I do have some concerns." Lester's smile faltered slightly. What kind of concerns? Well, it's my house, honey. My home. What if things don't work out the way we hope? What if there are disagreements about how things should be handled? Mom, his voice took on the patient tone adults use with confused children. We're family. We're not going to have disagreements about your care. Of course not. I smiled, letting my expression remain slightly uncertain. It's just that I've been independent for so long since your father died. The idea of depending on others. You wouldn't be depending on us. You'd be contributing to the family. Lester's grip on my hand tightened slightly. Your wisdom, your help with the boys, that's invaluable. And we'd handle all the boring stuff. Bills, maintenance, property management. As if my home were a business venture to be optimized. What about my things? I asked. My furniture? My pictures? 30 years of memories in this house. We'd figure it out. Keep what fits, maybe put some things in storage. He waved his free hand dismissively. The important thing is that we'd all be together. I pulled my hand away gently, as if I needed to think. In reality, I needed to keep from saying what was really on my mind. Instead, I stood and walked to the counter, refilling my coffee cup to buy time. Lester, can I ask you something honestly? Of course, Mom. Anything. I turned to face him, leaning against the counter in a pose I'd perfected over decades of serious mother-son conversations. Do you remember when you were 16 and you wanted to borrow my car for that party at Laura Powell's house? He looked confused by the change of subject. Vaguely. Why? You promised me you'd be home by midnight, that you'd be responsible, that nothing would happen to the car. I kept my voice gentle, conversational. Do you remember what happened? Lester shifted uncomfortably. Mom, that was 20 years ago. You came home at 3 a.m. with a dented bumper and beer on your breath. I took a sip of coffee, studying his face. When I confronted you, you told me the dent was already there, that I must have forgotten about it. I was a kid. I made mistakes. You did. And do you remember what I told you then? No, not really. I told you that lying to someone who loves you is the cruelest thing you can do, because it forces them to choose between believing you and trusting their own eyes. I set down my mug. I chose to believe you then, even though I knew better, even though it hurt. The kitchen fell silent. Lester's face had gone pale, and I could see him trying to figure out where this conversation was heading. Mom, I don't understand what this has to do with. It has everything to do with it, sweetheart. I moved back to the table but didn't sit down. Because now you're asking me to make another choice. To believe that this arrangement is about my well-being, about family unity, about the boy's future. Lester's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But my eyes are telling me something different, I continued softly. They're telling me that you and Elsie see an opportunity, a way to solve your financial problems by convincing your old mother to sign over her most valuable asset. That's not... Mom, you're being paranoid. Am I? I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I'd prepared that morning. Because I've done some research, honey, about estate planning, about property transfers, about the rights of family members in shared housing arrangements. I opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Property valuations, legal precedents, financial statements I'd requested from the county office. Lester's eyes darted across the papers, and I watched the color drain from his cheeks. Did you know that once I sign this house over to you, I have no legal recourse if you decide I'm no longer welcome here? I kept my voice conversational, almost academic. Did you know that as the property owner, you could evict me with 30 days' notice, regardless of any verbal agreements about basement apartments? We would never, wouldn't you? I pulled out another sheet, a printout of real estate listings I'd researched. Because houses in this neighborhood are selling for quite a bit more than they were 5 years ago. Almost enough to pay off your mortgage and Elsie's credit card debt, with plenty left over for the boys' college funds. Lester stared at the papers as if they might burst into flames. How did I find out about your debts? Honey, you've been living in my house for 8 months. I see the bills, the statements, the collection notices you try to hide in my garbage. I gathered the papers back into the folder. I also see the spending, the takeout, the clothes, the toys for the boys that cost more than my grocery budget. He looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw my little boy again, caught in a lie. desperately searching for a way out. But here's what really breaks my heart, Lester. I sat down across from him again, my voice gentler now. You thought I was stupid enough to fall for it. The words hung between us like a blade. Lester's face crumpled, and I wondered if this was genuine remorse or just the panic of a plan falling apart. Mom, please, it's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. But even as I asked the question, I could see him calculating, trying to find the right words to salvage the situation. The boy who'd once confessed his mistakes with tears in his eyes had become a man who measured his honesty by its usefulness. And in that moment, I knew my decision was already made. Lester left that afternoon without getting the answer he wanted, but not without hope. I'd been masterful in my performance, wounded but not angry, disappointed but still loving. I'd let him think he could still win me over with time and the right approach. As I watched his car disappear down the street, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Phase 1 was complete. The next 2 weeks became an elaborate dance. Lester visited daily, sometimes bringing the boys, sometimes arriving with Elsie in tow. They'd grown more creative in their appeals, painting vivid pictures of family dinners around my dining room table, holiday mornings with all of us together, the boys growing up with their grandmother's constant presence and wisdom. Think of the memories we'd make, Elsie said one evening as we sat in my living room, Daniel and Timothy playing with their tablets on the floor. The boys would have such stability, such a sense of family history. I nodded thoughtfully, playing my part. It would be wonderful to be more involved in their lives. What they didn't know was that I'd been incredibly busy during those 2 weeks. I'd met with Denzel Powell 3 more times, each visit more productive than the last. I'd driven to Millfield Creek repeatedly, sometimes with a surveyor I'd hired privately, sometimes with representatives from Meridian Development Corp., the company that had quietly been acquiring land in the area for their new tech campus. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Lester and Elsie saw only worthless scrubland, Meridian saw the future. They saw proximity to the new interstate exit, access to fiber optic lines, buildable acreage in a county hungry for economic development. They saw what I'd suspected for months, that my worthless 23 acres were potentially worth more than my house. But I wasn't ready to play that card yet. First, I needed Lester to commit fully to his deception. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard Elsie's voice drifting from the living room, where she was talking on her phone while the boys watched television. "No, Mom, she hasn't signed anything yet," Elsie was saying, her voice lower than usual, but not quite low enough. "Lester's working on it, but she's being stubborn. Yes, I know how much the house is worth. That's exactly why we need to close this deal soon." But I continued chopping vegetables, my knife moving steadily through carrots and celery while I listened. Once we get the title transferred, we can figure out the rest. The basement thing was just to get her to agree. No, of course we're not actually going to let her live there long term. Can you imagine? But we needed something to make her feel secure about signing. The knife paused in my hand. There it was. The truth I'd known but needed to hear confirmed. "We're thinking once she's signed everything over, we'll give her a few months to adjust and then start talking about assisted living. There are some nice places, and with the equity from this house, she could afford the best care." "Yes, Mom, it's perfect. She gets professional care, we get the house, and everyone's happy. Everyone's happy." That phrase again, but now I understood what it really meant. Everyone except me. I resumed chopping, my movements more deliberate now. Elsie continued her phone conversation, apparently convinced I couldn't hear her from the kitchen. "Lester's handling the legal stuff. We found a lawyer who specializes in elder estate planning, and he says as long as she signs willingly, there won't be any complications. Of course she'll sign willingly. She trusts Lester completely." Did I? The question hung in my mind as I scraped vegetables into the pot. I'd raised Lester to be honest, to be kind, to consider others before himself. Where had I gone wrong? Or had Elsie simply found and exploited weaknesses that were always there? When Lester arrived home from work an hour later, I was setting the table for 4. I'd made his favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, mashed potatoes, homemade rolls. The boys had cleaned up their toys and washed their hands without being asked. The perfect domestic scene. "Something smells incredible," Lester said, loosening his tie as he entered the dining room. You've outdone yourself, Mom. I wanted tonight to be special, I replied, lighting the candles I'd placed on the table. Family dinner, just the four of us. Elsie appeared from the living room, having finished her phone call. She'd freshened her lipstick and smoothed her hair, ready to play her part in this evening's performance. "This is so lovely, Janet," she said, settling into her chair. "Just like the family dinners I grew up with." We ate in comfortable conversation, the boys chattering about school, Lester sharing stories from his office, Elsie asking appropriate questions about my day. To an outside observer, we might have looked like the perfect multi-generational family, happy, connected, secure in our love for each other. After dessert, I stood to clear the dishes. "Boys, why don't you go get ready for your baths? Lester, Elsie, could you stay for a few minutes? I'd like to talk." Something in my tone must have alerted them because they exchanged a quick glance. But Elsie smiled encouragingly at Lester, probably thinking this was the moment they'd been working toward. I returned from the kitchen with a manila folder, different from the one I'd shown Lester before, but equally prepared. I sat down at the table and placed it in front of me, my hands folded on top. "I've made a decision about the house," I began. Lester leaned forward eagerly. "Mom, that's wonderful. We're so glad I'm going to sign it over to you," I continued, watching their faces light up with triumph. "All of it. The house, the property, everything in my name." Elsie actually clapped her hands together. "Oh, Janet, this is such wonderful news. The boys will be so excited. We can start planning the renovations right away, and there's just one thing I need first," I said calmly. They both paused, waiting. "I need complete honesty from both of you about your intentions." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the boys upstairs, running water for their baths, their voices echoing down the hallway. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the living room, marking off the seconds while Lester and Elsie processed my request. "I'm not sure what you mean," Lester said finally. I opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a transcript I'd made of Elsie's phone conversation, complete with timestamps and direct quotes. "I mean, I'd like you to explain why you told your mother that the basement apartment was just temporary, a way to get me to sign the papers." I kept my voice level, conversational. "I'd like you to explain your research into assisted living facilities and how you plan to use the equity from this house to pay for my care there." Elsie's face went white. Lester stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. "I'd also like you to explain why you think I'm too stupid to overhear phone conversations in my own home," I continued, "or too naive to understand that you've been planning to remove me from my own house once the title transfer is complete." "Mom, that's not—" Lester started. "Please don't," I said quietly. "Don't lie to me again. I heard every word, Elsie. Every single word about your plans for my future, your timeline for my transition to professional care, your excitement about the equity you'll gain from my generosity." Elsie found her voice first. "Janet, I think you misunderstood. Did I misunderstand when you said, and I quote, 'Of course we're not actually going to let her live there long term'?" I pulled out another sheet. A recording app on my phone had captured the entire conversation, because I have it all right here if you'd like to refresh your memory. The color drained from Lester's face as he realized the full scope of what I'd documented. Elsie's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, gathering the papers back into the folder. "I am indeed going to sign the house over to you, Lester. Tomorrow, in fact. I've already scheduled the appointment with Denzel Powell for 10 o'clock. Relief flooded Lester's features, but I wasn't finished. "However, there's going to be a small addition to the paperwork, a clause that Denzel suggested for my protection." I smiled at them both, the same smile I'd perfected over 2 weeks of performances. "It's called a reversion provision. It means that if I'm ever asked to leave this property for any reason, including suggestions about assisted living, concerns about my ability to live independently, or simple changes of heart about our arrangement, the house immediately reverts back to my name." The relief on Lester's face transformed into confusion, then growing alarm. "Furthermore," I continued, "I'll be retaining a significant financial cushion for my future needs. You see, I've decided to sell that worthless property out in Millfield Creek. You remember it? The land you've always said was impossible to develop, too far from everything to be valuable?" Lester nodded slowly, clearly not understanding where this was heading. Well, it turns out you were wrong about its value. Quite dramatically wrong, actually. I pulled out the final document from my folder, a purchase agreement with Meridian Development Corp. I'm selling it tomorrow for $2 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds from upstairs seemed to fade away as Lester and Elsie stared at the number on the contract. 1.2 million, I repeated, savoring each syllable. For land you thought was worthless. Land I'll use to secure my independence, regardless of what happens with this house. Elsie's voice came out as a whisper. That's impossible. Is it? I suppose that depends on whether you bothered to research development plans for the county, zoning changes, infrastructure improvements. I closed the folder with a satisfying snap. Things I've been tracking for months while you've been tracking my vulnerability. Lester finally found his voice. Mom, we never meant— Yes, you did. I stood up, feeling more powerful than I had in years. You meant every word of it. The only thing you didn't mean was to get caught. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden where I'd taught my grandsons to identify different birds, where I'd planned to spend my remaining years in the home Gregory and I had built together. So here's your choice, Lester. We can proceed with the house transfer under my terms, with the reversion clause that protects my right to remain here, or we can forget the whole arrangement. Either way, I'll be financially secure enough to make my own choices about my future. When I turned back to face them, I saw something I'd never seen before in my son's eyes. Fear. Not of losing the house, but of losing control over me. And I realized that was exactly what I'd wanted him to feel. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes decisions feel inevitable. I dressed carefully. My magenta suit, the one I'd worn to Gregory's funeral, to Lester's graduation, to every important moment that required dignity and strength. In the mirror, I saw a woman who had found her backbone again. Lester and Elsie were already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, both of them looking like they hadn't slept. Elsie's makeup couldn't quite hide the circles under her eyes, and Lester's tie was crooked, a sure sign of his agitation. The boys sat at the table eating cereal, blissfully unaware that their world was about to shift dramatically. Good morning, I said pleasantly, pouring myself coffee from the pot they'd made. Ready for our appointment with Denzel? Lester looked up from his untouched breakfast. Mom, about last night. What about it? I kept my voice light, cheerful even. I thought everything was settled. You're getting what you wanted, the house in your name. I'm getting what I need, security and protection. Everyone wins. Isn't that the phrase you've been using? Elsie set down her mug with trembling hands. Janet, maybe we should talk about this more. Think it through. I have thought it through, dear. For weeks, actually. While you were planning my future, I was planning my own. I smiled at Daniel and Timothy, who were watching this exchange with the focused attention children reserve for adult conversations they don't quite understand. Boys, you should probably get ready for school. After they'd thundered upstairs, Elsie leaned across the table. The reversion clause. It's not necessary. We're family. We would never ask you to leave. Of course you wouldn't. I sipped my coffee, meeting her eyes steadily. Just like you would never research assisted living facilities or discuss timelines for my transition with your mother. Just like Lester would never meet with lawyers about elder estate planning without mentioning it to me. Just like you'd never see this house as anything but a loving family home, and not a solution to your financial problems. Lester pushed back from the table. How did you know about the lawyer? I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo I'd taken 2 days earlier. Lester shaking hands with a man in a suit outside the offices of Martin and Associates, elder law specialists. I'd followed him that afternoon, curious about his late client meeting that had kept him from dinner with his family. Peter Martin, I said, reading from my phone's notes. Excellent reputation for helping families navigate complex estate transfers, particularly skilled at cases where elderly relatives need guidance in making decisions about their assets. Elsie's face had gone ashen. You've been spying on us. I've been protecting myself. There's a difference. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. The appointment is in an hour. Are you coming? Or should I handle the paperwork alone? They came, of course. They couldn't risk me changing the terms of our agreement, or worse, backing out entirely. The drive to Denzel Powell's office was silent except for the radio playing softly in the background. I watched the familiar streets of my neighborhood pass by, wondering how many of these routes I'd travel again once my plan was complete. Denzel greeted us in his wood-paneled conference room, the same space where he'd helped us navigate Gregory's will 8 years earlier. He was a man in his 70s, with kind eyes and the sort of steady presence that came from decades of helping families through difficult transitions. Janet, Lester, Elsie. He shook hands with each of us, his gaze lingering on my face with what I interpreted as concern. "I have all the paperwork ready, but I want to make sure everyone understands the implications of what we're doing today." "Of course," Lester said, settling into his chair with visible relief. "We want to make sure Mom is protected." Denzel opened the file folder on his desk. "The house transfer is straightforward. Title will pass from Janet to Lester effective immediately. However, Janet has requested some unusual provisions." He spread out the documents, pointing to specific clauses. First, the reversion provision. If Janet is asked to leave the property for any reason, or if her living situation is changed without her explicit written consent, the house automatically returns to her name. Lester nodded, though I could see the tension in his jaw. Second, Janet retains all decision-making authority regarding modifications to the property, including any basement renovations or structural changes. Elsie's sharp intake of breath was audible. Third, and this is crucial, any attempt to circumvent these provisions, including but not limited to suggestions about alternative living arrangements, discussions of Janet's capacity to live independently, or consultations with elder care facilities, will trigger an immediate reversion of the property. Denzel looked up from the papers. "Lester, do you understand these terms?" "I understand them." Lester's voice was tight, but he was nodding. "We just want Mom to feel secure." "Excellent." Denzel turned to me. "Janet, are you certain this is what you want? Once you sign, the house will be in Lester's name, with these protective provisions in place." "I'm certain." I picked up the pen he offered. "But I do have one more request." Lester froze. "What kind of request?" "I'd like Elsie to sign a separate document acknowledging her understanding of these terms." I looked directly at my daughter-in-law, just to ensure there are no misunderstandings down the road. Elsie's eyes darted to Lester, then back to me. "What kind of document?" Denzel pulled out another paper, one I'd asked him to prepare the day before. "It's a simple acknowledgement that Elsie understands the reversion provisions and agrees not to interfere with Janet's occupancy of the property." "Is that really necessary?" Lester asked. "It is, if you want me to sign the transfer," I replied calmly. The room fell silent except for the tick of Denzel's desk clock. Finally, Elsie reached for the pen. 15 minutes later, we walked out of the office with Lester as the legal owner of my house and me as its protected occupant. The irony was perfect. He'd gotten exactly what he'd asked for, and I'd ensured it couldn't be used against me. But we weren't finished yet. That afternoon, while Lester was at work and Elsie was at her yoga class, I made another visit, this time to Meridian Development Corp's temporary offices in downtown Millfield Creek. The building was sleek and modern, all glass and steel, representing the future that was coming to our rural county whether we were ready or not. Maya Godot, the development director I'd been working with, greeted me with genuine enthusiasm. She was a woman in her 40s, efficient and direct in a way I appreciated. "Mrs. Harrison, everything is ready for the closing. Our surveyors confirmed the property lines, and our environmental assessment came back clean. Are you prepared to proceed?" "More than prepared." I settled into the chair across from her desk. "But I do have one additional request." She raised an eyebrow. "What can we do for you?" "I'd like the transaction to be kept confidential for the next 30 days. No public records, no announcements, no contact with other family members." "That's unusual, but not impossible." "May I ask why?" I smiled, thinking of Lester and Elsie at home, probably congratulating themselves on their successful manipulation. "Let's call it a surprise for my family." The closing took an hour. When it was finished, I had a certified check for $247,000 and a letter of credit from Meridian's bank guaranteeing the funds. I also had something more valuable than money, the knowledge that I could take care of myself, that I wasn't the helpless elderly woman my son and his wife had tried to convince me I was. I deposited the check at First National, where I'd banked for 30 years. then drove to the other side of town to look at a property I'd been considering for weeks. The downtown loft was in a renovated historic building, with exposed brick walls, tall windows overlooking the Millfield River, and enough space for a woman starting over at 63. The realtor, a sharp young woman named Georgia, walked me through the space again. "It's move-in ready, Mrs. Harrison. The previous owner was an artist, so there's excellent natural light and built-in storage. And the price includes all appliances. What about the parking situation? There's a reserved spot in the building's garage, plus guest parking on the street." She opened the French doors that led to a small balcony. "The river view is what most buyers love about this unit." I stood on the balcony, looking down at the water flowing steadily toward some distant destination. The afternoon sun felt warm on my face, and for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: excitement about the future. "I'll take it," I said. Georgia blinked in surprise. "Don't you want to think about it? Discuss it with family?" "I've done all the thinking I need to do, and my family doesn't get a vote in where I live." 2 hours later, I'd signed the purchase agreement and arranged for a cash closing within the week. The loft would be mine, free and clear, bought with money my son had dismissed as worthless. I'd gone from potential victim to property owner in the span of a single afternoon. But the most satisfying part was still to come. That evening, I cooked dinner as usual, set the table as usual, called everyone to eat as usual. We sat around the same dining room table where I'd confronted them the night before, but the atmosphere had changed. Lester and Elsie were being excessively pleasant, almost obsequious in their attention to my needs. "How was your day, Mom?" Lester asked, passing me the salad bowl. "Did you do anything interesting after we left Denzel's office?" "Oh, just some errands," I replied, cutting my chicken with deliberate precision. "Banking? Shopping? Looking at real estate?" Elsie looked up sharply. "Real estate?" "Just browsing," I said innocently. "You know how it is. Once you start thinking about property values and market trends, it becomes fascinating." I let them digest that information while I finished my meal. Tomorrow, I would give Lester and Elsie exactly 30 days to demonstrate whether they could honor the spirit of our agreement, not just its legal requirements. Whether they could treat me with respect and genuine care, rather than as an inconvenience to be managed. But I already knew what the outcome would be. I'd raised Lester, after all. I knew exactly how this story would end, and I was very much looking forward to the conclusion. I gave them exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks to prove they could honor our agreement, to show me the respect they'd promised, to demonstrate that their concern for my well-being was genuine rather than performative. I watched them with the patience of a woman who had already made her decision, but wanted to be absolutely certain she was justified in making it. The signs started small. Elsie's subtle comments about the difficulty of cooking for so many people when she'd never cooked a meal in my kitchen. Lester's suggestions that I might be more comfortable with a simpler morning routine that didn't involve the boys' breakfast chaos. Their increasingly frequent private conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. But it was the phone call I overheard on a Tuesday evening that confirmed everything I'd suspected. I was in the garden, deadheading the last of the season's roses, when Elsie's voice drifted through the open kitchen window. She was talking to someone, her mother again, I assumed, and her tone had the conspiratorial quality I'd learned to recognize. "No, the reversion clause is ironclad. Martin looked at it and said we can't force her out directly. But there are other ways to make someone understand they're not wanted." I crouched lower behind the rose bushes, my gardening shears forgotten in my hands. Small things. Making her feel like she's in the way, like she's a burden. Eventually, she'll suggest the move herself. Yes, exactly like you did with your father-in-law. It just takes patience. The comparison hit me like a physical blow. Elsie's father-in-law had died in a nursing home 2 years ago, alone and forgotten after his family had slowly frozen him out of their lives. I remembered Elsie's casual mention of his passing, the absence of grief or regret in her voice. The basement idea was never going to work long-term anyway. Can you imagine having her underfoot constantly? But once she's in assisted living, we can sell this place and move somewhere better, somewhere that actually fits our lifestyle. I stood slowly, my knees protesting after the prolonged crouch. The roses swayed in the evening breeze, their thorns catching the last light of the day. Gregory had planted these bushes for our 10th anniversary, and I'd tended them for 23 years. They would bloom again next spring, but I wouldn't be here to see them. That night, I began my final preparations. The moving company I hired was discreet and efficient. They would come on the morning of October 15th, exactly 30 days after the house transfer, to collect the belongings I'd secretly packed and stored in the garage. The loft was fully furnished and ready for occupancy. I'd even arranged for utilities to be transferred, and had given notice to the local newspaper delivery service. But first, I had one more conversation to have. I found Lester in his old bedroom on Thursday evening, working on his laptop while the boys played in the hallway. He looked up when I knocked on the door frame, his expression cautiously friendly. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" I entered the room and closed the door behind me, noting how he instinctively minimized whatever he'd been working on. "I wanted to talk to you about something important." He saved his work and turned to face me fully. "Of course. Everything okay?" "That depends on your definition of okay." I sat down in the desk chair that had once held my teenage son while he struggled through algebra homework and college applications. "Lester, do you remember when you were 12 and you stole $20 from my purse?" He looked genuinely confused by the change of subject. "Vaguely. Why?" "You took it to buy a video game you wanted, thinking I wouldn't notice. When I confronted you, you lied about it for weeks. Made up elaborate stories about finding the money, about me miscounting, about your father giving it to you." I studied his face, looking for some recognition of the parallel I was drawing. "Do you remember what finally made you confess?" Lester shifted uncomfortably. "Not really. I told you that lying to someone who loves you is a form of theft. You're not just taking their money or their trust. You're stealing their right to make informed decisions about their own life." I leaned forward slightly. "You cried when you finally understood what you'd done. You promised me you'd never lie to me again." The room fell silent except for the muffled sounds of Daniel and Timothy playing in the hallway. Lester's face had gone pale, and I could see him beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. "Mom, if this is about the house, it's about respect, Lester. It's about honesty. It's about whether you see me as your mother or as an obstacle to your financial security." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small recording device. "It's about phone conversations where your wife discusses strategies for making me feel unwanted in my own home until I agree to move to assisted living." His face crumpled as he recognized the device. "You recorded us?" I protected myself. Again. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. "And tomorrow morning, I'm going to do something that might seem cruel to you, but which is actually the kindest thing I can do for both of us." "What are you talking about?" "I'm going to teach you the most important lesson you apparently never learned from me." I walked to the door, then paused with my hand on the knob. "That actions have consequences. That lying to someone who loves you eventually costs you their love, and that your mother is a much smarter woman than you gave her credit for." The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I dressed in comfortable clothes and practical shoes, then made coffee and breakfast as I had every morning for 8 months. The boys came downstairs chattering about their plans for the weekend, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change dramatically. Lester appeared in the kitchen first, looking haggard and worried. He'd clearly spent the night thinking about our conversation, probably trying to figure out damage control strategies. "Mom, about what you said last night." "Good morning, sweetheart." I handed him a cup of coffee, my voice cheerful and warm. "Sleep well?" Elsie entered before he could respond, dressed for her Friday yoga class, but moving with less than her usual confidence. She'd probably been briefed about my conversation with Lester. "Morning, Janet," she said carefully. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It certainly is." I smiled at both of them, then at Daniel and Timothy, who were arguing over the last waffle. "Boys, eat up. You don't want to be late for school." The normalcy of the scene must have been reassuring to Lester and Elsie because I saw them relax slightly. Perhaps they thought last night's conversation had been an empty threat, a moment of maternal drama that would pass like so many others. They were about to learn otherwise. At exactly 9:30 a.m., I heard the moving truck rumble up the driveway. Lester was at work, Elsie was at yoga, and the boys were safely in school. Perfect timing. I opened the front door and greeted the crew chief, a competent-looking woman in her 40s who'd impressed me during our initial consultation. "Mrs. Harrison, we're here for the scheduled pickup." "Excellent," Everything's ready in the garage. It took them less than 2 hours to load my carefully selected belongings. My clothes, personal items, Gregory's desk, my grandmother's china, photo albums, and the few pieces of furniture that held genuine sentimental value. Everything else I left behind, including the expensive items Lester and Elsie had always admired. I stood in the living room after the truck had pulled away, looking at the spaces where my life had been. The house felt hollow now, like a stage set waiting for new actors to bring it to life. I walked through each room one final time, saying goodbye to 32 years of memories. In the master bedroom, I left a manila envelope on the dresser where Lester couldn't miss it. Inside was a letter I'd written and rewritten a dozen times, along with copies of all the documentation I'd accumulated about their deception. Then I picked up my purse and the single suitcase I'd packed that morning, walked out the front door, and locked it behind me for the last time. The taxi I'd called was waiting in the driveway. As we pulled away from the house, I didn't look back. I'd done enough looking backward. It was time to face forward. My phone rang as we reached downtown. Lester's name appeared on the screen. "Mom? Where are you? Your things are gone, and there's a note." "I'm exactly where I should be, Lester," I said calmly. "I hope you and Elsie enjoy the house. You worked very hard to get it." "What do you mean?" "Mom, we can work this out. Whatever you think you heard. I heard exactly what you wanted me to hear, eventually. And now you have exactly what you wanted. The house, the equity, and complete freedom from the burden of caring for your aging mother." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Lester's voice came through, smaller and more desperate than I'd ever heard it. "Where are you going to live? That's no longer your concern, sweetheart. You'll have 30 days to figure out how to manage without my help. With the boys, with the bills, with all the little things I took care of while you were planning my future." I watched the river come into view as we approached my new neighborhood. Consider it a learning experience. "Mom, please, we never meant—" "Yes, you did. That's exactly what you meant. You just never meant to get caught." I ended the call and turned off the phone. The taxi pulled up in front of my building, a beautiful brick structure with wide windows and a view of the river that never stopped flowing toward somewhere new. I paid the driver, took my suitcase, and walked through the front door of my new life. Behind me, the phone began ringing again. I didn't answer it. After all, I had a life to rebuild, and at 63, I was finally free to build it exactly the way I wanted. Some lessons, I thought as I rode the elevator to my floor, can only be learned the hard way, and some people can only be loved from a distance. Lester would understand eventually, or he wouldn't. Either way, it was no longer my problem to solve. If you've made it this far, thank you. I hope this story made you feel something. If it did, consider subscribing.